we are so excited you're here. Horizon donates $25 to Compassion International in your honor. And if you're in person, you can also pick out a coffee mug on the connection table. If you'd like to give to support the work that Horizon is doing in our community, you can do so online at relationshipsnotreligion.com. We also have PayPal, Venmo, or there's a box on the connection table. Next Sunday, we will be upstairs in the green studio on the second floor. We'll have signs pointing to where we are. They're redoing the windows in here, so we cannot be in here. Let's start worshiping the Lord through music this morning. Join us.
Let's sing together today. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this rainy day. We needed the rain. Thank you for all you give to us. We know that you're able with every victory in our lives, even when we are walking through the trenches, God. Be with Alex as he speaks, brings us your word, and open our hearts to receive from you this day. And we pray, amen.
Matthew chapter 12. I just walked away from my daughter who wanted to play with me more, and she's devastated. I know my heart is not broken because I've come back here to do this. Matthew chapter 12, though, starting in verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And you're like, oh, now I know why I have meat on my feet, right? His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And he answered them, haven't you read? This is a real slam on the Pharisees here, because the Pharisees memorized the Old Testament, and Jesus is like, don't you know the Old Testament? Haven't you read this? What David did when he and his companions were hungry, he entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the temple and yet are innocent? You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and yet priests have to work on the Sabbath. They're in the temple. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the house, Lord of the Sabbath. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They said to him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And he said to them, if any of you has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is always lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as his other hand. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. That escalated quickly, right? You go from eating a little bit of grain while you're walking along to them plotting a murder to kill Jesus. So what's going on here? If you've ever watched an old Western movie, you can instantly tell the good cowboys and the bad cowboys, because good cowboys wear white hats, and bad cowboys wear black hats. And it's real obvious. You're like, oh, that's going to be the bad guy, this is going to be the good guy. I remember when Star Wars Episode 1 came out, and in the promotional materials, they had pictures of Darth Maul. Nobody looked at Darth Maul and was like, I wonder if he's going to be a Jedi. You can tell, he's going to be the bad guy, right? The church I was going to at the time was like, don't go see Star Wars Episode 1, the devil's in it. And I was like, obviously they're fighting the devil, so that's a good thing. So I went and saw him. In modern movies, you can sometimes spot the bad guys, because I don't know if you know this, Apple does not allow a bad guy to use an Apple phone in film or television. And so if there's ever a bad guy, they'll be using an Android. So if you're like, how come everybody's using Apples except that guy's the murderer? That's a quick way to know. You see characters using an Android, they're the bad guy. Apple's pretty clever. In the real world, though, bad guys aren't always obvious. And you've probably found this to be true. There's people you trusted, and they ended up being bad guys. Or there's some people that you thought were going to be helpful, and they were harmful. The bad guys aren't always obvious in the real world. Sometimes they do all the right things, they say all the right things, but their hearts are evil. And the bad guys in the Gospels are like that. The bad guys in the Gospels, in the narratives about Jesus, the bad guys are the Pharisees. Even more than the Roman Empire, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious leaders, they're the bad guys. Rome is kind of painted as an ignorant oppressor, but the Pharisees know better. They should know better. They know the scriptures, and yet they willingly choose to ignore good and do evil. But most people in the first century, if you walked around in the first century and you said, who's the best person you knew? They would say, a Pharisee. They were the best, most moral people that they knew. Now, the Pharisees were a Jewish religious group and school of thought that emerged in Palestine during the Second Temple period. That's around 500 years before Christ to about 70 years after Christ. About 70 years after Christ, Rome came in and just wiped everything out because there was a rebellion, and the Pharisees ended after that. That's why we don't have Pharisees today. If you go into a Jewish synagogue, there's not Pharisees. They were known for their personal piety and expertise in the law, and when I
word Pharisee comes from a Hebrew word that means separated. So they're like, I'm a little bit separated from you. I'm holy. I'm set apart. I'm better than you. That's what it meant to be the word Pharisee. And they were no legal experts who loved to debate about the scriptures. They believed in following legal traditions as well as the scriptures. So they thought the kind of oral tradition that developed around the Old Testament was just as important. To be a Pharisee, almost 100% of Pharisees had the entire Old Testament memorized. Just think about it. These were not people who took their religious duty lightly. Part one of being a Pharisee was memorizing the entire Old Testament. So these guys were really serious about it. There were also people that Jesus had more names to call, more criticisms to give, more corrections to give than any other group of people. This is just a quick sampling of what Jesus called the Pharisees. Blind guides and blind fools. A den of vipers. Literally a pit of serpents, like the serpent in the Genesis story. Whitewashed tombs. Hypocrites. And Jesus was, as far as we know, the first person to ever use the Greek word hypocrite in a religious sense, because it literally means an actor playing a part. He was one of, we get the word hypocrite today because Jesus takes the Greek word and uses it to refer to Pharisees. So why were the Pharisees so fired up about wheat? What's the big deal? Like, right? Why is this such a big deal? Now, a little backstory here. The law said that the poor or travelers could walk into a field and eat whatever they could separate with their hands. They couldn't chop down a whole bunch and pull it away, but whatever you broke off, like this, you could rub in your hands, something like this. You can try this. Everybody has meat around you. Take a little piece, rub it in your hands. The chaff starts to come out. And this is not food grade meat. Do not eat this. Okay? Do not eat this meat. But you can see how the little kernels of wheat start to come out. See a little kernel in there? And they would snack on this. Yeah, do not snack on it. It is not food grade. Do not feed me. But the law said if you were on a journey, you could walk into any Jewish field and just pull off whatever you wanted by hand and eat so that you wouldn't get famished and collapse on the road. It was like a social initiative to help protect travelers so they wouldn't get hungry on the road. It was essentially ready-made trail mix wherever you went because you were constantly walking through these fields. And remember the story of Ruth, where Ruth is poor, she goes back to the land of Israel, and she goes out and collects the grain around the corners. When they plowed it, they were supposed to leave the corners for travelers and for the poor, so that they would not starve. This was a social net built into the first century to help the poor and the famished traveler not collapse on the road. The Pharisees knew this was allowed by the law. Most roads at the time ran through people's fields, and so this was not the Pharisees saying, hey, you guys are trespassing, you guys are stealing. They know all that's allowed. The debate is about whether or not it is okay to do what they did on the Sabbath. Now, God had ordained the Sabbath as a blessing, a day for rest where the Jewish people would Shabbat. That's the Jewish word. It literally means stop. And remember all that God has done. It's a reminder that God is in control, that the world keeps spinning when we stop worrying, we stop working, we stop wanting. Guess what? The sun still comes up and still goes down. The rain still comes. The clouds still blow by. God's still in control. And Jesus here, his argument about why this is okay, he argues, he's like, King David did something that only a priest was supposed to do, but it was okay because he was God's anointed king. And Jesus is saying, I'm a bigger king than King David. The greatest king of Israel ever, I'm a bigger king than him. So if David could bend the rules because he was king, I can bend the rules because I'm the king of kings. And then he goes on to say, and he says, and don't the priests working in the temple get to bend the rules and work on the Sabbath? And he goes, I'm bigger than the temple. This really got them fired up because no one's bigger than God's temple except, of course, God. And so this is another subtle way that Jesus is saying, hey guys, it's me. I'm the long-awaited king, the Messiah. He even calls himself the Son of Man, his favorite way to reference himself, a reference back to Daniel chapter 7, where there's this image of this Son of Man who will come and rule and reign over the earth. When we think about the Sabbath, though, most of us don't get fired up. This isn't something that's like, you know what, this is going to get me more fired up than anything else. But for the first century Jewish people, nothing got them fired up as much as the Sabbath. In fact, during a previous revolution, They had been attacked on the Sabbath day because they knew the Jews would refuse to fight on the Sabbath. And a bunch of them would come in and got wiped out. They took the Sabbath so seriously, they wouldn't even defend themselves on the Sabbath. But most American Christians today don't practice any kind of Sabbath in the West. There's been kind of a modern resurgence. I see some trendy books and videos coming out like, let's rediscover this ancient practice. Sabbath is a 24-hour period of time that ancient Jews would practice from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, and they would stop, rest, and light, and worship. I've been convinced that Sabbath practices can still be deeply important in our busy modern lives. I try each week to turn off my phone for 24 hours, to sit still, to try not to do the million things I want to do, and just carve out time to rest and reflect and remember that God's in control. I'm not. But the Pharisees had developed this series of oral teachings called the Mishnah, and they included 39 forbidden labors on the Sabbath. You could write one letter on the Sabbath, and that was okay. You wrote 2 letters, work, straight to, Pharisee jail. You could pick up a rope, but if you tied a knot with that rope, straight to Pharisee jail. If you lit a flame, jail. No, you can't do those things. Now, the actual Old Testament, if you go back to the scriptures, it only forbids 2 things in scriptures: gathering sticks and lighting fires. And then a general command to not work on the Sabbath. But the Pharisees took that vague command from God as an opportunity to get super precise and controlling. The Pharisees valued slavish obedience, not just to God's law, but to their interpretation of it. They couldn't tell the difference between what God said and what their interpretation of what God said was. In their minds, to disagree with their interpretation was to disagree with God. They were, in other words, the first fundamentalists. One of my mentors described modern Pharisees as someone who finds ways to police the beliefs and behaviors of other people instead of finding ways to love other people. And you could probably immediately think, oh yeah, I've been to some churches with some of those people. I know some of those people. Or some of you might be like, I am one of those people. Do a little self-reflection. Jesus stresses that people are more important than roles in his answer and in the way he acts after this. Rules exist for people, people don't exist for rules. God commands things not to control you. God was like, man, that looks like that would be a lot of fun. I'm going to say that's a no-no. And we're going to, tell people to do these other things. No. God says there are some paths that lead to destruction, some paths that lead to abundant life. I want to put you on a path that's going to give you an abundant life. God does not give us roles to control us, but to funnel us towards joy. Now, I think that all of us don't need to be a little self-reflective here, because most of us grew up in or around American churches that have been built on the assumption that as a person's knowledge of the Bible increases, their spiritual maturity will increase along with it. The thinking is, as you know more facts about the Bible, you will become more spiritually mature. As you attend more religious activities and conform more to outward demonstrations of morality, surely you're going to become more spiritually mature. And at first, this is true. If you come from outside the church, you get plugged in, you start reading about the Bible, you have no knowledge of the Bible, and encountering it will change you. But you quickly reach a point where learning more about the Bible won't make you more like Jesus. How do I know? I've tried it. I've read through the Bible multiple times. I'm reading in this book the Bible every day. I went to Bible college, in seminary. I've taken Greek and Hebrew classes. I've literally taught in hundreds of Bible studies. I've been in hundreds of Bible studies. And what I realized was knowing more about the Bible, just that alone, won't make me a better person. I was so cynical and anxious and angry. I knew more than almost everyone around me about the Bible, but I wasn't more loving than most of the people around me. I wasn't more patient. I wasn't more self-sacrificing. The Pharisees had the entire Old Testament memorized, but they wanted to kill Jesus. Just think about it. And I think the way we do church in North America is designed to produce Pharisees instead of disciples. Now, this isn't me knocking scripture. I love the Bible. We're going to look at the Bible every Sunday. If you come here, I'm going to talk from the Bible every Sunday. I'm always going to teach from the Bible. I'm going to encourage you to read it and study it. But the baddest guys in the New Testament knew the Bible the best. They knew the Bible better than the disciples. The baddest guys in the Bible kept the rules the best. The baddest guys in the New Testament attended religious events and customs the best. And you might be like, well, Alex, I'm good. I never read the Bible, and I have no morality at all. I just do whatever I want. I don't keep any morals, so I'm good. I'm not saying that. I'm not knocking on the Bible or moral rules or religious events or customs. Thank you for coming to church. We need services, we need studies, we need Bible. But I'm saying that we must not confuse those things with spiritual maturity, because if we do, we're saying the Pharisees were the most mature people in the Bible, when the gospel writers want us to say, oh, they're actually the most wicked. We don't need less than Bible study and religious attendance. We need something much more than this. Jesus outlines spiritual maturity as this. If you look at the passage, what does he say to them? You need to go and figure out what he means by, I want mercy, not sacrifice. He's quoting Hosea 6:6, where God tells Israel, what I was really after was a people who acted like me and showed mercy to other people, not people who just blindly sacrifice animals to me and keep the rules. Not blindly going through religious rituals, but forgiving people as God has forgiven us. And then he demonstrates the other outline of spiritual maturity, doing good to the hurting. And so on the Sabbath, he goes, he sees someone whose hand is up. He could wait till the next day to avoid this controversy, but he says, why wait when I can help someone who's hurting right now? And he heals the guy's hand. Dr. Tim Matthews from the Bible Project defines righteousness as being in right relationship with God and right relationship with other people. In other words, we are spiritually mature when we love God as reflected in how we treat people made in God's image. The rules, the scriptures, it's all about being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what he did. Loving, helping, and healing people. And what Matthew wants us to wrestle with, the question he wants us to sit with is, in this passage, am I the Pharisee? Or am I a disciple? Am I a Pharisee or am I a disciple? Am I someone who lives and loves like Jesus? Someone who shows forgiveness and brings healing to people like Jesus? Or do I merely look the part? Now, I think in our culture, we don't have as much of a problem with religious Pharisees. In some circles, we do. Our culture is many times like, oh, religious obligation, like I don't want any of that. But I've found a new thing crop up in a lot of my friends' circles where they leave a highly religious circle and they say, those people are Pharisees. And so now they become a Pharisee criticizing Pharisees. Have you seen people like this? And they're like, I'm no longer this religious bigot over here. Now I'm a bigot towards religious bigots. You know, and they start critiquing other Christians constantly. And so anything they talk about, and I'm like, you're still a Pharisee. You're just not a Pharisee to this. You're now a Pharisee towards Pharisees. The Pharisees kept the law to impress people and earn positions. Jesus says students of his way of life, his kingdom people, are going to do the right thing because they love God, they love him, and they love others. This is the greater righteousness. Jesus previously in Matthew says we need a righteousness greater than the Pharisees because everything the Pharisees did was for show. The greater righteousness, Jesus says, is love instead of law. Now, it's human nature to want to do things that make us look moral, right? Everybody's familiar with virtue signaling. You know, and you're like, it's Black History Month, and then this company that has a long history of racism starts putting out these ads with Martin Luther King, but they never acknowledge or address their long history of racism. And they're like, it's all good because it's Black History Month. Here's a fun quote. And you're like, virtue signaling. You're trying to look moral instead of doing things that actually make us moral. Jesus rebukes the Pharisees in a few chapters later in Matthew 23, right before their plot to kill him fully takes effect. This is what he says. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. You are hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs. You look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people to be righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Did you catch the irony in this passage? The Pharisees are telling Jesus, hey, you can't eat grain on Sunday. You can't heal somebody on a Sabbath, not on a Sunday, on a Sabbath. But you know what they thought was okay to do on the Sabbath? Plot the murder of someone. You see that last line? They leave because he just killed someone on the Sabbath. He just defended his disciples eating on a Sabbath. Sabbath, they leave and plot a murder, and they thought that was okay. That's hypocrisy. We can get to a point where we excuse all kinds of evil actions because we think we're protecting God. Guess what? God doesn't need our protection. He wants us to show people mercy. There's a number of high-profile, big American Christian denominations who have had a bunch of sex scandals. And when you read some of these stories about how they protected the organization and they covered things up and they tried not to let things get out into the public so that God's important work wouldn't be stopped or prevented. And I think, what hypocrisy. We think we're defending God, and what we're really doing is we're excusing evil things in order to protect our image, to protect our money, to protect our power. Pharisees. Who do you need to show mercy to? Think about the people in your life you encounter, and you're like, oh, there's so many things wrong with them. I can point out so many problems in their life. How can I show them mercy? My natural tendency is not to look at people and be like, they're hurting. How can I help? My tendency is, they're a mess. Here's everything that they need to do to fix it. Right? Jesus wants us to have the eyes of his eyes, not the eyes of the Pharisees, who see people and say, how can I show mercy? How can I see their pain and bring healing? I want to end with this quote from Richard Rohr. Jesus tried to change people by loving and healing them. His harshest words of judgment were reserved for those who perpetuated systems of inequality and oppression, who through religion itself felt they were sinless and untouchable. Which technique are we going to use to reach people with the good news of Jesus Christ? His technique, by loving and healing people, or the Pharisees' technique, who think, we can force people into conforming into Jesus' image. There was an interview with the president of Iran, recently died in a helicopter crash, and so 2 candidates are running for president now. And one of the candidates is much more kind of liberal and more open to dealing with the West rather than a fiercely conservative Muslim like the other candidate. And he stood up and he gave this talk, and I thought it was so insightful. He said this: for a long time, our government has tried to force people to become moral Muslims by force. And he said that will never work. And I think, how long has the American church tried to force people to conform to the image of Jesus? We've tried to use Pharisee method to get people to conform to Jesus, and Jesus tried to change people by loving them and healing them, and now it's our time. Jesus, thank you for your word, and thank you for this challenge to my own life. You know, my tendency is to be a Pharisee, not a disciple. My tendency is to act like the Pharisees and not act like you. God, I pray that you would forgive me for so often seeing the problems people have instead of seeing the pain they have and how I can help heal that pain. We give me eyes to be merciful, because you don't just want me to live a moral life. You do want that, because that leads to abundance. You don't want me to just know the scriptures. You do want them, because in the scriptures I find you. You want me to become a person like you, to be transformed by your word, to be transformed by your teaching, so that I actually act like you act, that I actually show mercy to the hurting and the helpless. And I pray today, Lord, that as we go out this week, that we will not see people as problems to be solved, but as people to be loved and served, that will have your kind of spirit. I pray this
joy and hope this week. You are dismissed.